Good evening. Hello, everybody. Hope you're sitting comfortably and ready for what promises to be a great show today. I'm sorry for the delay. Uh, as you may have seen in the chat, there was my neighbor, just as I was about to click the button to go live, was decided to hoover the driveway and his car, which is directly outside of my window. So I thought, let's just give it a few minutes. And I think he stopped for now. If he starts up again, I can only apologize for the sound quality. But hopefully that's done. Um, before we get into the topic, while people are kind of tuning in and joining the stream, I'll just update you as to what I've been up to the last few months, or because I've been away for a wee while, and you might be wondering, where did Nathan go? So, well, as my avatar suggests, one of the main things I've been doing is I graduated last week. Um, I'd actually received my doctorate 2 years ago. August 2020 was when I passed, but due to the pandemic, or more strictly the lockdowns, right? Um, Everything was closed, and so it wasn't possible to graduate for at least till now, basically. And though that's been a long time waiting, it was actually really nice because some of my friends who I did masters with were also graduating at the same time. So that was a really quite nice and a fitting way of closing off this chapter of my life. And we got a really nice day, and it was good just to be with family, celebrating in such a beautiful city as Edinburgh. It was just, it was really good. And then the other thing, I've been away on holiday for a week or two, which has been really good. I haven't had a holiday really since Christmas. And let me see if I can show you a couple of photos. So we went to the Highlands and one of the islands off the west coast of Scotland, called Colonsay. It's a really beautiful place. Let's see. Hopefully this will show. Yes, so here it is, the island of Colonsay. It's about 2 hours out on the ferry from Oban, which is often described as the gateway to the Isles. And what kind of threw us a wee bit was we had travelled up to spend the night in Oban, and then we would go across on the ferry. But due to strong winds, the ferry was cancelled, so we had to spend a few days exploring the Highlands, which was great. We went to a place called Inverary. I don't know if any of you have ever been, but they have a museum there, which is Inverary Prison. It's a fully intact prison from the Victorian era, and it was great. Get an audio set, and you go around and you discover uh, how the inmates lived, what the uh, judicial system was trying to achieve with the punishments that they imposed. It was a really amazing experience, and there was one thing in particular that stuck with me. So in that time, they really tried to make prison a horrible place to be, and one of the ways of doing that was by making it really boring. So male prisoners were expected in that in Inverary prison to turn what was known as the crank, and they would have to do this 14,040 times a day. Now, this crank was attached to a big, large circular barrel, and within this barrel was sand. And so it's quite a heavy thing. You got to try it out while you were there, and it was quite tough to do. They had to do this 1,400 times, I should say, and it had no purpose. It wasn't to make like food or to power the electricity or anything like that. It had no function. It didn't produce anything. They just had to do it. The idea was, because it's so boring, it will give them time to think about the what they did was wrong, and they won't want to go back to prison as a consequence. I found that really interesting as an idea because nowadays they had a modern prison cell by comparison, and the guy's got a PS4 and a computer there. It was there's not an opportunity to get bored in the same way, although I know there's a lot of mundane tasks in prison. So that was something quite striking. Anyway, so we finally got across to Colonsay, and as you can see, there's some beautiful uh, scenery there. It's very striking. And Vingle in the chat. Hello, Vingle. Good to see you, friend. You've just mentioned that A is Old Norse for island, like modern Norwegian. Well, it turns out that the Vikings inhabited Colonsay, and it was one of their main uh, places of dwelling in the islands because it's not super close to Ireland, but it's in traveling distance from Ireland and Scotland. So it gave them great coverage over the Western Isles. And what we're seeing here is actually a Danish fort was built on this cliff face here, looking out over the sea to the west. So yeah, and there was many of these. They found multiple Viking longboats, burial mounds, and so on the island, but also um, Christian sites, Celtic Christian sites. Columba was meant to have been there. Saint Columba, that is, not our good friend Columba, and also Saint Oran and the monastery of Oronsay is just over the a causeway. It's really quite an amazing place. And then yeah, we just got beautiful weather. This is a place called Ardskenish, which I assume it has kind of Nordic roots, but I'm not totally sure. This was Kaloran Bay, beautiful, beautiful place. It's really nice too. So on the island, the animals just roam. Uh, they have right of way on the road, so you're often stuck behind a herd of sheep or some cattle. But there's something quite refreshing about that. So yeah, I had a great time there. It was good to refresh. I feel very energized for getting on with work. Uh, Snooze you lose. This is the island of Colonsay. It's just off the west coast of Scotland, and it's it's a very tranquil place. Not only is it filled with beauty, but there's a calmness to it. Even when it was raining or a bit stormy, it just felt very peaceful, like the world had stopped, and you could just enjoy life. Uh, I imagine it's a bit different in the winter, but it was a great place to go on holiday, and I would definitely try to again, and would recommend it to anybody. There's only one village on the island. It's a very small place of maybe 100, uh, probably less than that. There's only about 100 people living on the island, and but there's a good kind of community life. They've got a hotel where they play folk music every week. There's always lots of there's a various museums that they kind of run as part of the history of the island. It's a good place. It's a good place. I kind of wish I didn't have to come back, but work calls, work calls. Anyway, that's where I've been. And turning to tonight's stream, I realised that I've brought this forward. It was scheduled for the 30th of July, but but I wanted to do it because I had a bit of time. I'm currently writing a chapter for my upcoming book, and I managed to finish the section. So I thought I'll just do this now because I can't guarantee that I'll have the time later. And then moving into August, I'm off to the I'll be preparing my talk for the Witten event. Some of you will know this. Shieldings ran an event last year. This year they're running another one, and I'm very honoured to have been chosen as one of the speakers. So over August, I might not be around too much again. So I just thought let's do it tonight. Let's do this topic, and I think the Norman Yoke is a really important idea insofar as it had been influential in shaping English and American national identity and political philosophy. And yet it's not necessarily well known. And I'd be interested, for those of you who are watching, press 1 if you've heard of the idea of the Norman Yoke before, press 2 if you haven't. I think it's really helpful because it helps to make sense of various things which are foundational to certainly English identity and the politics of today, the way that kind of class dynamics work, but also deeper philosophical principles about who should rule in a country. It also provides a very interesting lens for tackling maybe some issues that we see today and getting to the root of what's really going on, because there's so much which, well, many people talk about rank punditry, right? And many of the issues that go on in kind of uh, that sort of discussion are surface level. They're dealing with the leaves, you might say, but every leaf can grow back or be replaced. It's not essential to the tree itself. The trunk and the roots, that's what we want to get to and deal with. If you want to cut down the tree, you don't cut down every leaf one by one. You take on the trunk and you uproot it. The Norman Yoke gives us a lens to look at some of these more essential aspects to these things going on in our culture. And so I think it'll be very helpful to explore the various ways it's been understood and been influential. Just looking at the chat, great to see so many friends here tonight. And it seems that many of you have already heard of this. So that's excellent. And I'm looking forward to your contributions throughout. So let me just give you a very brief outline of the Norman Yoke. And then what I'm going to do after that is go into the various specific ways that it was interpreted. I think there's four main ways that it was engaged with more detail. And then we'll look at how we can use this to analyze certain aspects in our current culture. That's the plan. So, a very brief outline of the Norman Yoke. Well, as its name suggests, it begins with the Norman conquest of England, or maybe even before. Let's go before. So, the idea is that Anglo-Saxon England was a place of liberty. Uh, Men were free and treated as equals before the law, and that they may have even had forms of representative government and a fair judicial system, insofar as it was one where you were judged by a jury, by 12 peers. This was a place of a golden age, and in some accounts, it's actually seen as the embodiment of a Christian nation. However, with the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror defeating Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, this was undone. The Normans, when they took over, well, William claimed all the land of England as his own and redistributed it to his followers, and they became the new aristocracy. They gained all the wealth of the nation. And through laws, both canon law and feudal law, written in Latin and French, they were able to suppress the Saxon inhabitants of England. Indeed, the whole system was now geared towards the Norman benefit against the interests of the Saxon majority. And at every turn, these Normans were humiliating and undermining the Saxon peasantry. In fact, it's suggested in some places that they only put up with the Saxons. They didn't kill them all off because they needed them to till the fields and look after their sheep. If they could, they would have done away with them. Now, this may have some roots within. Well, it's undoubted that this idea had its origins within the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings and the total upturning of England. However, this conception of what happened really emerges in the 17th century. That's when it becomes a key part of English political discourse. And so I just want to clarify from the beginning that this stream is not so much a discussion of how the Normans changed England, but rather how, from the 17th century onwards, people engaged with the history around this period and how they used it for their own political ends. I'm not an expert on the Norman era, and I wouldn't feel confident to address it. It's rather how its legacy impacted English political philosophy. Before we continue, I think maybe to kind of illustrate the general idea further, we may look to a really quite influential novel in its own day. That is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Scott, who deserves a stream of his own one day. He is an amazing man who really forged Scottish culture as we know it today, and was just prolific in his output and recognized all around the world for the stories he wrote. And it was a pretty good novelist as well. He, in Ivanhoe, wanted to write a story for England set in a medieval context. And it's set during the time of Richard the Lionheart. And in the first few pages, he addresses the context in which this is taking place. And I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from it, because he wants to outline to his reader the Norman Yoke, as it were. And throughout the book, it is an important aspect. A circumstance which greatly tended to enhance the tyranny of the nobility and the sufferings of the inferior classes arose from the consequences of the conquest by Duke William of Normandy. 4 generations had not sufficed to blend the hostile blood of the Normans and Anglo-Saxons, or to unite, by a common language and mutual interests, 2 hostile races, one of which still felt the elation of triumph, while the other groaned under all the consequences of defeat. The power had been completely placed in the hands of the Norman nobility by the event of the Battle of Hastings, and it had been used, as our histories assure us, with no moderate hand. The whole race of Saxon princes and nobles had been extirpated or disinherited, with few or no exceptions. Nor were the numbers great who possessed land in the country of their fathers, even as proprietors of the second, or of yet inferior classes. The royal policy had long been to weaken, by every means, legal or illegal, the strength of a part of the population, which was justly considered as nourishing the most inveterate antipathy to their victors. All the monarchs of the Norman race had shown the most marked predilection for their Norman subjects. The laws of the chase, and many others, equally unknown to the milder and more free spirit of the Saxon constitution, had been fixed upon the necks of the subjugated inhabitants, to add weight, as it were, to the feudal chains with which they were loaded. At court, and in the castles of the great nobles, where the pomp and state of a court was emulated, Norman French was the only language employed. In courts of law, the pleadings and judgments were delivered in the same tongue. In short, French was the language of honour, of chivalry, and of even justice, while the far more manly and expressive Anglo-Saxon was abandoned to the use of rustics and hinds who knew no other. Still, however, the necessary intercourse between the lords of the soil and those inferior beings by whom that soil was cultivated occasioned the gradual formation of a dialect compounded betwixt the French and the Anglo-Saxon, in which they could render themselves mutually intelligible to each other, and from this necessity arose by degrees the structure of our present English language, in which the speech of the victors and of the vanquished have been so happily blended together, and which has since been so richly improved by the importations from the classical languages and from those spoken by the southern nations of Europe. So you can see Scott is describing a situation where you have an ethnic minority in the Normans, and an elite ethnic minority ruling over an inferior plebeian class of Anglo-Saxons, and really in a tyrannical way ruling over them, not merely displacing them as the rulers of their own country, but then preventing them from taking part within the legal system, within the courts, because they don't have the language. This is a really interesting idea. I know Semiagog has looked at the ways in which language is tied fundamentally with power, and how um, markings, animal markings of territory are a form of written language. We see this here. French is almost the Norman marking of their power in the court, both in the royal court, but also in law. And given that most Anglo-Saxons would not know French, they are excluded from either defending their case or participating within the elite of society. And throughout the novel, and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, because I would fully recommend reading this. It's a great read. I'm really enjoying it. It's a he's got this brilliant ability to bring characters to life, and almost in a Shakespearean way present many different scenes and bring them together in a quite an exciting way. But throughout the novel, the idea of the Norman yoke is so important, and the interaction between Normans and Saxons is something that Scott explores. No doubt, I think, because of his own experience of the Act of Union between Scotland and England. And he was fascinated by wrestling with the idea of identity, and how Scots and English people could become one nation. I think he's playing with that in this. Um, but nevertheless, it's a really great read, and I'd recommend. So that's a kind of broad outline. But in the 17th century, there wasn't just one approach to the Norman yoke. There were different factions who were competing for political power during this period. Early 17th century England. We have just seen in 1603 King James VI of Scotland, from the Stuart family, from the royal line, descended from Mary Queen of Scots, becomes King of England. And later his son, Charles I, before the Civil War. They pursue a policy of absolute monarchy. And we'll get into that in a second. Another key factor is Parliament, mainly made of the propertied classes, freemen and that sort of group. And they have their own interpretation. And then you have maybe what you might call more craftsmen or plebeian groups, who themselves come up with their own interpretation. And so I think it'd be helpful to go through each of these and see how they engage with it and the specific differences. And then we'll move on to the more theoretical discussion. So the first group, and what these are what we might call the Royalist doctrine of the Norman yoke. And they use it to justify monarchical absolutism. James I argued in one of his treatises called the True Law of Free Monarchies, and he wrote this while he was before he became King of Scotland, King of England. Sorry. He argued the bastard of Normandy, that is William, set down the strangers, his followers, in many of the old possessors' rooms, as at this day well appeareth, a great part of the gentlemen of England, being come of the Norman blood, and their old laws, which to this day they are ruled by, are written in his language, and not in theirs, and yet his successors have with great happiness enjoyed the crown to this day. I should say as well, James himself was trained as a theologian and political philosopher by George Buchanan, who was a great Renaissance Scotsman, and he was able to compete on this sort of level intellectually. He was supported by none other than Francis Bacon, who in 1596 wrote that the ancient laws of England were planted here by the Conqueror. The Conqueror got by right of conquest all the land of the realm into his own hands, and it's implied that then he redistributed them in his own terms to his followers. So that there's this idea that, I think this really is where they're driving at, that the monarch has the right to rule all because William, by virtue of his conquest of England, has the right to all the land in England and to distribute it as he sees fit. He also has the right to dictate the laws of the land as he sees fit, and thus, as the as James and Charles are in the line of succession to William, they also have this right. Thus, they have absolute right over the land and laws of England. And in turn, they have the right to arbitrary taxation. So they can choose to introduce taxes on a fly. So Charles was known for taxing salt, for example, introducing salt taxes to raise money for his own projects or for his own armies, etc., etc. So you can see that there's a practical outworking of this. Because William conquered, therefore James and Charles can do what they want as rulers. And this becomes part of their case. And we could see this in a way as an extreme form of how to put it. Well, it's this idea that might makes right. You know, Thrasymachus in the Republic argues that justice is that which justice is the interest of the strongest. And in a way, that's what James is saying. Well, because William dominated this country, he had the right to decide how it was run. So the divine right of kings, which is also something which James will lean upon, has a new inflection here, that actually the king, the rightful king, is he who conquers. If he is conquered, he has the right to rule. And if that's the case, he has absolute right to rule. It's not qualified in any way. Might makes right. Force is enough. We've seen this in modern times, right? So the US invades Iraq and installs a liberal democracy, in air quotes, under its guidance. It believed it had the right to impose this upon Iraq because it had conquered it. There was no two ways about it. Nobody had a choice. So this isn't necessarily a new an idea that's out of habit. Those who conquer feel they have that justification. What's interesting is that hundreds of years later, the Stuarts are using this logic, and I think in part this appeal for the Stuarts and for the Tudors is rooted in the fact that they were there was questions about their right to rule in the first place. The Stuarts, being Scots, okay, they have a distant relative to the Tudor line, but they are not English in any meaningful sense. So they are they're essentially foreigners ruling England, especially with the fact that Charles, being married to Henrietta Maria, married to a French woman. So we're already getting Norman flavors here. The Tudors, having primarily Welsh descent, again, there's questions about their Englishness. And these kinds of questions actually facilitated during this period a renewed interest in the origins of English identity and its history, its founding history. You see in the later half of the 16th century, the founding of the Antiquarian Society, which starts to explore and challenge some of these assertions. You also have so you have this dynamic where these somewhat foreign rulers are trying to justify their own rule over England by the fact they share in this conquest of England that William had. I think I've explained that in a slightly muddled way, but I hope that makes some kind of sense. um, yeah, so I think. Oh, and one further point on this. So both the Tudors and the Stuarts trace themselves to King Arthur as well. They both claim that they have Arthurian blood, and this is tied into this because although Arthur is an English king, he's supposed to predate the Norman conquest. It is the nobility in the Middle Ages, the medieval era, which is interested in Arthur because it's about chivalry and courtly protocol. It's a story about that the French nobility can enjoy, or the French descended nobility. And so appeals to Arthur get drawn into this Norman Yoke idea too. He is seen as a precursor to William almost. And actually, the lower classes do not identify with Arthur at all. They actually challenge uh, the courtly dynamics that are present in the King Arthur story and see it as an English story which supports the rule of the Norman descended classes over England. So that's quite an interesting thing. We think of King Arthur as an English story, but given it was formed in a culture which was Norman descended, it's actually questionable. And I wonder if this is in part why Tolkien, who was a great lover of Anglo-Saxon, wasn't super keen on the Arthur legend or wasn't totally happy with it. He he doesn't want to draw on it too much in the Lord of the Rings, and I think this might be why. Anyway, so let's move into the second kind of approach. And this might be represented by Edward Coke, who was the chair of or the Speaker of the House of Commons in the early 17th century. And Coke takes a different view of the Norman Yoke. And I should say all of the other views stand against James's absolutism here. For Coke, the Norman conquest has corrupted English law, or at least has covered over parts of it. It hasn't been a good thing. Actually, what the yoke itself has taken away liberties and freedoms and rights which the English had under the Anglo-Saxon rule. And these rights are best glimpsed or seen within the common law tradition. He said to the House of Commons in 1621, "The grounds of our common laws were beyond the memory or register of any beginning, and the same which the Norman conqueror found within the realm of England." So we have feudal law and we have canon law of the church, but the common law has its origins in a pre-Norman era. And so it most thoroughly represents those rights and privileges that the English people ought to have by virtue of law, by virtue of the precedent set within Anglo-Saxon England. His colleague, if I can find the right page here, 66, John Pym in Parliament, put it even more starkly in 1628. He argued, "There are plain footsteps of those laws in the government of the Saxons. They were of that vigour and force as to overlive the conquest, nay, to give bounds and limits to the conqueror. It is true, they have been often broken. They have been often confirmed by charters of kings, by acts of parliament. But the petitions of the subjects, upon which those charters and acts were founded, were ever petitions of right, demanding their ancient and due liberties, not suing for any new. Coke and Pym are suggesting that this common law tradition is the basis for arguing for rights in the present. That because they had them in the past, that English men had these rights in the past, that they should have them now. They were expressed in the Magna Carta. This was a pushback against the Norman Yoke, but they need to be more fully reflected now. And in particular, what needs to be reflected is that there should be a representative parliament for the nation, that the king shouldn't be imposing his will upon parliament in an unjust way, as Charles was doing, that property rights should be protected as they are protected by English law. So essentially what they're suggesting is that the Norman yoke and its legacy and its abuses, especially under the Stuarts, is illegal, that it's against the laws of England as established in Saxon times. And these become maybe what you might say is the main parliamentarian approach to the Norman yoke in the Civil War period. There are some disagreements, there are some more radical elements, which we'll come to in a minute, but in general, it's this precedent-based argument against the conquest approach of James. So, by this logic, James I doesn't have the right to impose arbitrary taxes because Englishmen, by virtue of Saxon law, have the right to their own property, and money being a form of property, right? So you shouldn't be able to just arbitrarily tax them without parliamentary consent. And that is the key there, and that's one of the issues in the Civil War, is that Charles had been avoiding going to Parliament to raise money by introducing these arbitrary taxes, but he needed Parliament to raise more money. And that started the process. I should say he needed more money because the Scots rebelled over the English prayer book that he tried to introduce into Scotland. And so he needed money to raise an army. He did that with these arbitrary taxes. He lost the war. He had to pay money to the Scots. He didn't have any way to do that without going to Parliament, who had the right to consent to the raising of taxes or to disagree. So this seems to be the key issue for these sorts of thinkers. We then come... and so when Charles loses the war, you then see a reversal of the conquest argument as well, actually, because if a ruler has the right to impose their laws upon the nation because they've conquered, well, given Charles lost the Civil War and Parliament conquered him, you might say, Parliament then gains the right too. So either way, Parliament can argue from the Saxon basis or from this principle of conquest. But more radical groups had more, stronger critiques of the Norman yoke. The Levellers were one of these, and I've done a video elsewhere on the channel about the Levellers. So if you haven't had if you don't know much about them, I would encourage you after this to go there. But essentially, the Levellers were a populist movement emerging after the English Civil War was concluded, or at least the Second English Civil War. We often talk about there being one, but there's officially three. And this, following the defeat of Charles I, the Levellers believed that England ought to become a fairer society. However, what they found in reality was that in Charles's place, Parliament had taken over, and the fare of the ordinary man had not improved, not at all. And they've given that many of their ranks came from the soldiers of the new model army, they felt rather aggrieved about this because they had fought and given blood and lost uh, comrades in combat for what they perceived to be a move towards a better society, a pre Norman society, we might say. And what turned out was very little change for them, but much benefit to the generals and to the parliamentarians. So the Levellers took a more radical approach to the Norman yoke. And one of their chief spokesmen, John Lilburne, who was a chaplain to the New Model Army, wrote the following: "The greatest mischief of all, and the oppressing bondage of England ever since the Norman yoke, is this: I must be tried before you by a law, called the common law, that I know not, nor I think no man else, neither do I know where to find it or read it. The tedious, unknown, and impossible to be understood common law practices in Westminster Hall came in by the will of a tyrant, namely William the Conqueror." We can see here that Lilburne, who initially was sympathetic to the Edward Coke line, is arguing that he's wrong about common law. It is not the preservation of Anglo-Saxon law, it is actually itself a corruption. And he argues this on the basis of its unintelligibility. It was written in French and Latin. Most could not understand this then. As a consequence, it cannot be in the interests of the English people, because if it was, it ought to have been written in English, in plain English, in a simple way that anyone could understand it. Thus, Lilburne argued, it itself needs to be overturned, the common law tradition, and with it, the entire feudal system. That's right. He believed, like many levelers, that God had created all human beings as in status equal with one another, and that no one, therefore, had the right to rule over another except by consent. Thus, there are no divine right of kings. Nobody has an automatic, innate, or cosmological right to rule over, only by consent. So there are no nobles. The House of Lords needs to be abolished. Instead, there shall only be a representative democracy. The franchise needs to be opened wider, that all men, and he was clear, all men should be able to vote for their representatives in the House of Commons. Regarding the law, only we should do away with all lawyers, and we will not need lawyers because the laws will be written in English, in simple and plain English, and you will be tried by a jury of your peers, 12 men. And both of these things, the representative democracy and uh, plain law, in conjunction with protected property rights, were, in Lilburne's view, the essence of Anglo-Saxon society. The Normans had, through the imposition of a feudal system, undone this. As a consequence, removing the king is not the end of the process. It is only the beginning. The nobility need to be overthrown. The clerics and the lawyers need to be overthrown. And there needs to be fundamental judicial and parliamentary reform. So we might see the difference between Lilburne and Coke as this. Whereas for Coke, the Norman conquest had corrupted in part the laws of England, there was a pure thread of Anglo-Saxon law that had remained, and the issue was that King Charles was acting illegally in relation to the common law. By contrast, for Lilburne and the Levellers, the law itself is unjust and needs to be overthrown to be replaced by an Anglo-Saxon settlement. So whereas one, the law is still good, the system is still good, in the latter, the whole system needs to be thrown out. And what's interesting too is that the Levellers are perhaps one of the first groups to articulate in terms of political philosophy the idea that there is a ruling class whose interests are not aligned with the majority. Because the parliamentarian approach is to say, well, actually, what's wrong here is just one individual, Charles. The MPs are on your side. They rule in the interest of England. Whereas the Levellers are saying, no, actually, the whole system is rigged against the ordinary person. You might want to say the bourgeoisie are taking the labour of the Anglo-Saxons, the Norman bourgeoisie, uh, are exploiting the Anglo-Saxon proletariat. And this gets even pushed further by what we might call the fourth approach to this idea, the Norman Yoke, which was articulated by the Diggers, or a group who called themselves the True Levellers. The Diggers were around the same time as the Levellers in the late 1640s, early 1650s, and they what they disagreed about, what they disagreed with the Levellers on, was the issue of property. Because for the Levellers, they came from merchant classes typically, artisans, urban tradesmen. And one of their great concerns was that even with Charles gone, the nobility and the upper classes would continue to exploit them and tax them arbitrarily. Thus, their resistance to the entire system, to the Norman yoke, was a way of protecting their own property rights. And I've suggested elsewhere and on this channel, and various scholars have suggested that the Levellers are the precursors to Lockean classical liberalism. The Diggers believe that actually property rights themselves are an introduction by the Normans, or at least in an English context they are. They suggest that when God created the world, the entire world was shared or owned by all peoples. Nobody had any more right to any aspect of the world, the earth, than anybody else, and that the strong used their strength to serve the others and make sure everybody had enough to eat. However, in time with what we might call the fall, although they saw the fall of Adam and Eve as metaphorical for this, the strong, by conquest, took to themselves the earth and partitioned it for their own greed and lust. Thus, property rights began as a way of securing or protecting the theft of the rich or the powerful of the fruits of the earth from all peoples. So the diggers take this idea and say, okay, well, we're going to do away with the king. Great. And we're going to do away with the nobles. Well, that'll be good. Do away with the House of Lords. And we'll even reform the legal system. But just as property rights began with the theft in the primal era, so in England, property rights have their roots in the conquest of England by William the Conqueror, in his stealing of Anglo-Saxon, or stealing from the Anglo-Saxons what belonged to them and distributing it and using the law to protect it, protect this theft. So what we need to do is abolish all property rights and return it as common land to all the people, so that all people can till it and receive the fruits of it to fundamentally to survive. Because during this period after the war, many people were starving and in poverty and awful conditions. That's what really arose this sort of critique. And their main spokesman was Gerard Winstanley, and they were a rather small group. But one of the key things that they did is in 1649 or around that time, a group of them decided to take what was abandoned common land on St George's Hill, which is near London, and start digging on it to use it for their own community to produce food. And he defended this in front of General Fairfax in 1649, saying, "Seeing the common people of England be joint consent of the person and purse, have cast out Charles our Norman oppressor," so Charles I is a Norman here, "we have by this victory recovered ourselves from under his Norman yoke, and the land now is to return into the joint hands of those who have conquered, that is, the commoners, and the land is to be held no longer from the use of them, the commoners, by the hand of any who will uphold the Norman and kingly power still." So there is this idea that actually, by overthrowing the Norman, let's just call them bourgeoisie class for a second, the proletariat will inherit the means of production, the land itself, and that it will be jointly owned. That is the Digger vision. And many writers, including the historian Christopher Hill, have suggested, just in the same way that the Levellers are a precursor to classical liberalism, so the Diggers are the first, provide the first real articulation of what will become Marxism or the Marxist ideals. Remember, this is 17th century England we're talking about in the 1640s. I don't know where you find these ideas articulated in such a way before this point or adjacent to this point. These groups were very radical for their period. And we could have a whole discussion about how Puritanism or various versions of Puritanism gave birth to some of these very radical political philosophies. Anyhow, so we have four versions of the Norman Yoke theory. We have the absolutist monarchists who are arguing, well, because William conquered England, therefore I should be able to rule England absolutely, take its property as my own, tax the inhabitants as I wish, and demand total obedience because I am in his line. We then have the parliamentarians like Edward Coke arguing, well, actually, England's common law contains within it the Anglo-Saxon laws of our nation. And actually, King Charles, you are acting illegally in relation to these laws. We have various rights afforded to us by these laws as Englishmen. And thus, as Englishmen, we will resist you in civil war until we regain our English rights from your Norman tyranny. Then following on, we have two offshoots from this parliamentarian force, largely emerging out of dissatisfaction with the settlement that the English people got after the Civil War. The Levellers say it is not enough to return to common law, which is itself a Norman imposition upon England. We must do away with the whole feudal system and only have representative government in the House of Commons and a simple law that all can understand, which protects property rights. And finally, the Diggers, who suggest that's not far enough. The entire system, including property rights, is constructed in the interest of a ruling elite, the Normans, and thus we English commoners who, by right of conquest, just like William conquered England, so we have conquered the Norman uh, regime. Now we rule England, and so the land belongs to us. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned just at this point, but I'll bring in here, is that there is a slight shift with the levelers and the diggers in their form of argumentation. You will have noticed that all the way through, the issue has been about history, appealing to history as the basis for certain rights and privileges today. So James appealing to William's conquest to justify his own actions as a ruler, or Edward Coke saying, actually, we have the laws set down by Edward the Confessor. He was the big one they would appeal to. Edward the Confessor, manifested in the Magna Carta. These give Englishmen certain rights, so we should make sure we're enforcing these. The levelers and the diggers, to some extent, appeal to history, to an Anglo-Saxon golden age, but they also make a shift towards saying, even if the Saxons didn't have these rights, all men ought to have these rights. They see them as not just belonging to England because of a historical quirk of the Anglo-Saxon times, but rather that all men, as they are created by God, are afforded certain rights. The levelers believe that all are created equal before the law, while the diggers believe that all have a right to the fruits of the earth, to the produce of the world. So these rights, we could say, are innate or inherent in being human. They are inalienable rights belonging to each and every individual. And so the Anglo-Saxon context or golden age becomes less a source of these rights, but rather an example of a society which recognized these divinely given rights to each individual. So that's a shift in argument, and we'll return to that later in the stream. But where it becomes relevant once more is in an American Revolutionary context. So, following the Civil War in England, you have these various movements, but with the Restoration in 1660, the absolutist argument returns. But then by 1689, with the ascendancy of William of Orange to the throne of England and Scotland and Ireland, the absolutist disappears, and the parliamentarian or the Whig interpretation of the Norman Yoke, focusing on this idea of precedent, becomes the mainstream. However, in the period leading up to the French and American Revolution, influential American revolutionaries such as Thomas Paine, uh, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson return to the Norman Yoke in their revolutionary writings, portraying the struggle of the American people against King George as a reworking of the Anglo-Saxon peoples overturning the Norman yoke, the Norman imposed feudal system, both in terms of its political structure and its laws. Tom Paine was probably the most significant or most extensive writer on this subject. And in an essay written in 1776, Common Sense, he wrote, "A French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself king of England against the consent of the natives is, in plain terms, a very paltry, rascally original. It certainly has no divinity in it. The plain truth is that the antiquity of English monarchy will not bear looking into." He declared that the English constitution was, as a consequence, was noble for the dark and slavish times in which it was erected, but it is imperfect subject to convulsions, and incapable of producing what it seems to promise. As a consequence, the English constitution, legal system, political system essentially allowed for the rule of crowned ruffians. A republic is much preferable to gangsters being crowned, such as William the Conqueror. However, it was really in debate with Edmund Burke over the French Revolution in which these ideas become more fully worked out. Burke himself had questioned whether appealing to some kind of Saxon golden age was the best approach to law. But nonetheless, he argued that when it comes to rights, these are not abstract uh, things which exist um, outside of a legal system, but rather these are inherited privileges, franchises, and liberties. They are things which are afforded to us through the reference to antiquity, to what has come before. We could say here that what he's really saying is it's precedent and the development of principles in precedent which form the law and thus afford us our rights. So returning to that kind of Kochian idea, we have the right to representative government because it is established in English law from Anglo-Saxon times. Paine argued that the problem with this is that fundamentally precedent in itself is neutral, but what matters is the principle that the precedent continues. And in the case of England, whose constitution, whose laws were established by a tyrant in William the Conqueror, a bandit, its principles are designed to support the ruling class against the majority, thus appealing to antiquity. He writes, without any regard to the principle of the precedent, is one of the vilest systems that can be set up. So what matters for him is not so much the whether something was established in English law in before 1066 as whether the law itself is just or not. Thus, we can see where the American Constitution comes from, whereas the British Constitution is not written down and or formalized and thus open to continual development and response to precedent. The American Constitution sets out to defend certain inalienable rights. Thus, it's appealing to an abstract sense of justice or morality. So we can see how Paine's development of the Norman Yoke plays into these debates. And I haven't had time to read what John Adams says in full, but he's very much tying in with a lot of what Paine's saying here. So let's think about how some of what we've been going over could be used to engage with current things in the politics. And one thing to say is that really the Norman Yoke idea has disappeared from mainstream English political philosophy and American. While it was a big deal in the late 18th century, after that point, it no longer plays a significant role in either political system. It does appear in novels like Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, but it in part that in itself reflects that it's become a safe subject to discuss within a popular medium. It's no longer associated with revolution in the way it was in the English and American, the English Civil War and the and American Wars of Independence. And through the 20th century, it gets very little thrift at all. This is interesting to me because let's take the story of Robin Hood. Robin Hood, set during the reign of Richard the Lionheart, is an Anglo-Saxon yeoman who, returning from the Crusades, finds his country being ruled tyrannically by Prince John, and in his own local area, the Sheriff of Nottingham, and so and who are part of the Norman aristocracy, tyrannizing the Anglo-Saxon commoners. And so, as in kind of taking justice into his own hands, he robs from the rich Normans and gives to the poor Saxons. So there's a very strong class and ethnic dimension to the story of Robin Hood, very much presented in works similar, like Ivanhoe, right? You will not find this in 20th century discussions of Robin Hood. The the historical context is missing from that, and I do wonder if this is an interesting comparison. We were talking about the King Arthur myth or legends as identified as Norman in culture, whether the Robin Hood one is Anglo-Saxon in culture, and there's a bit of conflict between these two. But yes, so that's it's been erased, but yet it can be used as a useful lens for various things. Um, One thing we can look at here is that it's a good example of elite theory, or at least one aspect of elite theory, which is that the minority rules over the majority. And in this case, that's very clear to see. This is not it's an ethnic elite, the Normans, who are a minority in the country. They don't outnumber the Anglo-Saxons, far from it. But through superior force initially, and then through organization by establishing new laws in the land, which favor themselves, they are able to rule over the majority, the Anglo-Saxon majority. But there's an interesting twist here, because the Norman yoke itself is an idea which appealed to populist groups, such as the Levellers, who, in one of their petitions to Parliament, gained 100,000 signatures, which, to put in context, was about the population of London at that time. So that was a really big deal. They had a lot of support. The idea that there's an elite a foreign elite ruling over the country appealed to movements which were seeking to establish a new system of government, or maybe an older one, an Anglo-Saxon one, which would allow the will of the people to be represented and manifested in England. This idea could be played both in support of elite theory, as King James was kind of arguing, but also was used by populists and was very popular with them. It also appealed to a sense of patriotism, right? Because during the English Civil War, it helped mobilize men who believed that they were fighting for what belonged to them, not just as men, but as Englishmen. That they had these rights as Englishmen, as descendants from the Anglo-Saxons. So we have a class dynamic, an ethnic dynamic, or a nationalist dynamic here too. It also ties in with elite theory insofar as this whole issue of the Norman yoke is really at its heart a debate over what Gaetano Mosca called and coined a political formula. Now, in his book, The Ruling Class, Mosca defines a political formula as the legal and moral basis or principle on which the power of the political class rests. And this is what elsewhere is called the principle of sovereignty. Now, Mosca argued that each society has its own political formula, and it's rooted in it's essentially the reason why a certain group should rule over another. Why this elite should govern and do the things it does in this society. And what's key is that the elite has to persuade, as it were, the masses, the ruled, to believe this. It's not just a con, it's not just a cynical ploy. It actually is really important because each, well, for Mosca, he believed each of us believe that, well, we have a real need to believe that we're ruled by somebody who's legitimate, that we're ruled for a moral reason. And so the political formula of the elite has to convince us, or most people, that they are they will be able to attain that which we hold to be of great value. They are the instrument by which the ultimate ends, the absolute things that we value, will be achieved. That's why their rule is justified. And if a regime loses its if its political formula loses credibility with the ruled, it won't be long until a counter elite, in conjunction with the plebs, will come and overthrow the regime. This is a big part of Mosca's idea about how elite theory works, and this makes sense in principle because it's impossible for a, a, a regime to rule purely by force. It be as a minority, it would struggle to overturn a majority in military terms if it was constantly fighting with it. And also, it requires the majority to support it in various ways. Maybe it's in various forms of work, food production, uh, running services and systems which sustain the society. It needs the tacit consent of a large proportion of the populace for it to be successful as a ruling elite. And so it must persuade them of what the political formula, we might also call it ideology, which justifies this ruling class being in place. The Norman Yoke debates in the 17th century and later with the American revolutionaries are a discussion over what makes a ruling class legitimate or not. So for James the First, because William the Conqueror had conquered, he had the right to rule England. So the political formula there is one of might makes right. Conquest justifies my ruling. However, we can see that given there was so many groups who were opposed to this, it's no surprise that there was a civil war. There was an uprising of counter elites supported by a large proportion of the population against the regime, which itself was supported by a large proportion of the population in the Civil War. It was a military conflict, two sides standing for different political formulas. The parliamentarians, we might say, the Whigs later, say it's precedent, historical precedent, sets especially in law, the precedent of law sets provides legitimacy. Whoever upholds it is legitimate. So if a king goes against common law as established by the Saxons, he is no longer legitimate. His political formula is broken. And as we move to the other groups, the levelers and the diggers, we start to see a shift. So yes, there is the idea that, well, the Saxons had a certain society, a fairer society, but fundamentally, they believe that those who have the right to rule, or are those, well, the levelers would say those who have the consent of the people and are not acting beyond the rights and liberties of the people. The diggers themselves would probably say nobody has the right to rule as such, um, but rather are um, all people are equal sharers in the community, or equal rulers in the community. So they are the anti-elite theory group, you might say. They don't believe in any minority rule, but the others would have various formulas. And these sorts of debates are still acting out in modern politics. And I want to give you a couple of examples. So we will all have seen in recent times the recent Supreme Court decision over abortion and the overturning of the decision of Roe v. Wade. Now, what's interesting about this is the rhetoric of those opposing this decision, because they will say things like, this is overturning democracy, this is overturning women's rights, this is overturning the right to healthcare for women, this is overturning a liberal society. What they're really saying is that the Supreme Court has done something which is against abstract inalienable rights belonging to women. Whereas the Supreme Court decision is essentially saying we do not have legitimate precedent for sustaining Roe v. Wade. The Constitution doesn't provide this. And actually, I think this conflict comes down to a tension within the American legal constitution, actually, because the Constitution itself was written by men like, the Thomas Paine we were discussing earlier, who did not believe precedent was a basis for thank you, Sneezy Lose. That's right. The decision gives back to the state level, taking it out of the hands of the federal government. Yes, so it doesn't overturn abortion per se. It overturns the federal mandating of abortion beyond the state's own rules. What's going on here, though, is that you've got this tension between a constitution which in itself says we're going to defend inalienable rights. These come before the law, and the law is just a recognition of what belongs to each man and woman, to everybody. And with a system which has judges who make their decisions based on precedents set down by the Constitution, and thus do not look to whether something is an inalienable right, but rather is it established in the American Constitution or not. And so the ability of the opponents to appeal to the abstract rights of the woman beyond the law is a reflection of what's in the Constitution itself, which is a defense of inalienable rights. Whereas the English system, for example, built on precedent and not on inalienable rights, we can argue about whether the laws are just or unjust, but there's a much stronger sense, well, if something is precedent, then it stands, and it requires parliamentary intervention for it to be overturned. Whereas in the American system, you have people saying the judges should have kept this because it's morally right. They're not acknowledged. That seems in the American context, that makes more sense because that's the very basis of the Constitution. So I think the tension lies within the very system itself that's been set up in America in a way that, I mean, we probably have the same debate here, to be fair, but it's through and through precedent, whereas in America there's this tension. But we've also seen in America, so it's interesting because you might think then, okay, the progressive wing is fully abstract in its approach. Its fundamental arguments ignore precedent and historical kind of the historical affording of rights, because their program is to overturn any system which, in their view, undermines or obstructs the liberties and rights of individuals. I think that's a quite Rousseauian view. Man is born free and is everywhere in chains. It's society which chains you, so we need to overturn these things to make sure that you receive your rights. But we have seen, particularly in the area of race, a return to a historical approach on the left. And my example to you here is the 1619 Project. Whereas 1960s civil rights activists like Martin Luther King would first and foremost appeal to, well, it's interesting, they would appeal to their rights as beings created in the image of God for their equality, and to the Constitution, which supposedly recognizes these rights in all individuals, all Americans. So, again, inalienable rights. The current movement is to more of a kind of it's more akin to the historical approach of the levelers, because with the 1619 Project and other kind of discussions of whiteness and um, a white supremacist sort of system, the argument is, from its inception, America has been a country which has a two-tier system. You have had the white rulers, and we might call this the white man's yoke. We've got the Norman yoke. This is the white man's yoke upon blacks. And as a consequence, we need to overturn not just racists or official racists like the KKK, um, white nationalist groups, etc., etc. In fact, we need to overturn the system of government, which is inherently supporting uh, white men. We have to overturn the laws which support white men. We need to redistribute property which has been taken um, by white men. Essentially, this is a leveler and digger program against the Normans, but flipped round and saying, actually, let's think of it as the Saxons in this case are African Americans, and the Normans are white Americans. So it's a very strong historical approach because of these injustices that whites have inflicted upon blacks. Therefore, we need to overturn the system, political system, legal system, economic system. We need to redistribute wealth in forms of reparation. And then we might come to something which is a just society. Um, I think there's a parallel there in some way, because it's no longer talking about the rights of Americans as human beings. It's a historical narrative of oppression that needs to be overturned completely. So it's not identical because there's not an original age that they're appealing to. They're not appealing to some kind of golden age of African liberties. Although you can see with something like Wakanda that desire to create this kind of African um, paradise like the Anglo-Saxon one, untouched by white men. But there is this similar idea of a foreign oppressor um, who set up the entire system against not just a lower class, but an ethnic lower class that needs to be totally undone for the lower class to receive what they're due. In this case, reparations and ruling over their own lives. So I think that's an interesting shift in the way that it's being argued, and it very much parallels the Norman Yoke idea. Um, but as I say, like, this is again, this is appealing to a certain understanding of the political formula. It's about historical precedent rather than abstract right. So watch out for that. That's going to be an interesting thing when people get into these sorts of debates. Um, they're not paying attention to what the source of these rights are in the individual's view that you're engaging with. And so while you're arguing about rights, you disagree on the very fundamental nature of what affords such rights to individuals and or to rulers. And thus you're dealing with the leaves of the tree and not the trunk itself, which is where do our rights come from and who has the right to rule? Based on what? Is it a cosmological metaphysical principle which gives certain ethical ideas? Is it based on certain historical events? And so on. Um, I just want to tap into a couple more things here. So I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that you'll often find within an English context, well, somebody like Sargon of Akkad, who I think is a pretty interesting guy. He's got some interesting ideas, um, and I think one of the key things for Sargon is this idea of a quintessential Englishness. There's an English character which is being suppressed by, um, well, in his view, it would be Christianity, um, but also modernity. And if we could return to this kind of pagan Englishness, which I can't remember offhand, but I do think he's spoken about common law in the past as being something that we've inherited and we should return to. Um, then then we would live in a better country for the English. So it's this kind of English particularism that he advocates, and is very much in this sort of trajectory of the Norman Yoke, but without necessarily those aspects. I think it has some appeal because, as somebody mentioned earlier in the chat, I'm afraid I didn't see who. I'm sorry, but you'll know who you are. Um, the current English aristocracy is still descended from the Normans, and many of the people who, even if they're not officially aristocrats, but rise in the British parliamentary system, have Norman heritage. Uh, just think of somebody like so current. Well, they've been knocked out, but a couple of the leadership bids, Penny Mordaunt. Mordaunt. That sounds a rather French name. Um, or what about Tom Tugendhat, who has French origins? I think Alexander Johnson has some Norman connections, and yes, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. Well, uh, I think that these ethnic divisions, which still exist, although never explicitly discussed in anywhere in part of English discourse now, at least not between Normans and Anglo Saxons, is still there in the class system, and as a consequence, it as a consequence there is this tacit appeal to when somebody like Sargon appeals to kind of Englishness, they're sort of invoking the memory of the Anglo-Saxon against the Norman. He wouldn't say that explicitly, and I don't even know if he knows this theory, the Norman Yoke, but it's there's a tacit sort of appeal to it. Um, I think though what I find troubling about it is at least the way he would present it. And I think it's an issue with some of the 17th century critiques, is it sees Englishness as a rather static thing that isn't isn't and cultures in general as very static. That you have the English, you have the French, you have the Chinese, and fundamentally these don't change much over centuries. And if there is change, it's usually because there's been an imposition of one culture upon another. The issue here, though, is actually, well, um, the Anglo Saxons themselves are a very flimsy basis for this sort of argument because, well, the Anglo Saxons were not natives to these lands. But further than that, well, okay, we've got this Anglo Saxon tradition, and we have these Norman laws. And as Scott suggested, the two become one in the English language. And so, at what point does the integration of Anglo-Saxon and Norman, um, for somebody like Sargon, that can never become English. You have to remove the Norman for it to be English. Whereas my question is it possible that there can be an integration of certain aspects, or do we have to do away with everything that's Norman to return to the to true Englishness? The same could be said of Christianity. So he will see this as a foreign religion, which it was, and against the principles of pagan morality. He has this some idea of kind of justice as desert, and he doesn't think this is a part of Christianity. Um, but this is where we get into trickiness because what we know about pagan England primarily comes from Christian sources, which were emerging very early within the English context. And indeed, what we know about the Anglo-Saxon is primarily from Christian sources. And so then you have to wonder, well, at what point does Christianity become integrated into at what point is it Anglo-Saxon Christianity or Christian culture, or is it always a foreign element to Anglo-Saxon? I'm probably not wording this very clearly. I guess I'm just trying to pose the point. If after so by the time of 1600s, Christianity's been in the land for um, best part of 1,000 years, is it still a foreign religion at that point, or is it a part of the English identity? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Um, it strikes me that there must be some room for mutability within our conception of national identity, or else you're going to always be in this position where you you can't see. Well, to me, the issue is then, is it what becomes recognizable as English? Uh, it's a tricky question. It's a tricky question, and that would be true of any national identity. Because if you were really taking this logic as far as you could, you wouldn't identify the Anglo-Saxons as English. Well, no, that's not true. They were the first English. There was Britons before that. So, um, what natives are we going to be descended from? I guess that's the question. Um, but I think there's a strong pull, right? Because there is it, it, it gives to the dynamic of fighting against an oppressor a patriotic dimension and a fight for kin group, which is lacking from a lot of political philosophy today in certainly in the Anglosphere, um, which is important because these things matter. Kin, culture, heritage, these are part of who we are, and it's a it's a it's one of the myths of the Enlightenment that we are individuals rather independent from our contexts, from where we come from. We belong. We are not just born as automatons. We have a givenness to us, which has been built over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years indeed. And we have a responsibility to those who have shaped us to preserve those best parts of what we are and to pass it on to our children because it's a beautiful thing. Your your home, your historical home, is something which is precious. The people talk about diversity so much. There is a really beautiful diversity in the world, which is the many cultures which each across the world and people groups who have their own lands, their own places, their own histories and traditions. And these are precious things, and it's wonderful that there are so many different ones in different places. And I think it's this myth that we're all just the same, and we should all belong to one kind of mass uh, um, homogenous man. It's a terrible thing, and it destroys the kaleidoscopic beauty of our um, different heritages. So anyway, that was a bit of a rambling tangent, uh, but just some thoughts there on a kind of aspect that you'll see maybe somebody like Sargon. Um, so yeah, I think that's all I've got on the Norman Yoke. I'm gonna have a quick look through the chat. If anybody has any comments or questions, please write them in, and um, I'm going to try and aim for 9 o'clock to finish. So uh, yes, let's see. Um, Hello to everyone. Again, it's good to see you all here. Some wonderful names here. Vingle, Flora, good to see you. Snoozy Loos, I like it. John, oh, John is such a wonderful man to see in the chat. Every time he's there, um, always brings joy to my heart because he's just he always wishes God's blessings on people, and I think that's a really lovely thing. Um, Thomas Sugg, John Boy, good to see you. See you. Scarletan, I see that you are still annoyed about the Normans. I am too. I am too. um, oh, thank you, Minoran. Very kind of you. It was a good day, and I'm glad I got to have it because I didn't know after 2 years of waiting whether it would happen or not. So I'm really, yeah, it was great. I'm really grateful. Uh, hello, God's own prototype. Good to see you. Flora. People are locked out of the legal system now by legalese, hence lawyers and the need for most people to pay for them to cut through. Yes, I agree. And that's what the levelers were saying, that actually a lot of the um well, it was even more stark, right? Because it was in Latin and French. But even if it was translated into English, the laws were so overcomplicated that nobody could argue or, well, first understand them and thus argue in defense of themselves against these laws. And so it favored the clerical classes who supported the aristocracy in subjugating the Saxon peoples. And today we still see that. It's almost impossible to go into court by yourself without legal representation because you'll just get demolished because you don't know all the precedents, you don't know how to argue a case even necessarily. Even if you're good at argumentation, it's a whole different ball game within a court. Uh, Interestingly, um, I thought this was interesting. So Penny Mordaunt, I know I shouldn't be watching the Tory leadership election. I know I'm a terrible reactionary, but she was saying that we should simplify the tax code so that people could understand it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. She's tapping into this uh, leveler approach to the Norman Yoke. Uh, she believes that people should be able to understand what the tax system is and thus be able to um, have justice according to it. There's probably a lot of truth to that. Let's see. The lion eats the gazelle. Yes, so this is the conquest theory of right. I guess the question is: are human beings? Should human society be structured according to that of the animal kingdom? You'll find some arguing this. The in a way the pickup artist approach kind of analysis of male hierarchies, and somebody like Jordan Peterson, they're essentially suggesting that hierarchies tend to favor certain kinds of men, and these tend to rule over other men. Often, although not always, physical prowess is part of that. So even if violence isn't necessary today, it's a leftover aspect of it, or power. Power is one of the other sources of uh, being an alpha male. It's often a chicken and egg, though, isn't it? Do you have power because you're an alpha, or are you an alpha because you've managed to get power? It often forms each other, but certainly that sort of approach would tie in with the lion eats the gazelle. The alpha man rules because he is the mightiest, you might say. Um, um, but certainly the levelers and the diggers would say that's not a good system, and the precedent view that we looked at with Coke. Um, the Norman yoke is what English men and women have been living under since 1066, when the Normans invaded and stole everything from our forefathers. Yeah, so I mean that's certainly you could put it that way, with certainly with the class system at the moment. But I guess the question is: are we going to go back just to the Saxons, or are we going to go back further in terms of our heritage? And I'm not trying to make one of these arguments that, oh, Britain's a nation of immigrants. I'm not making that argument at all. I think that's a terrible argument for kind of any precedent, because these were invasions, right? But I guess I'm just questioning at what point are we going to draw where we were robbed. I think that's the question, because I have Celtic ancestry from the borders, which I know, given other parts of my ancestry, were dominated by the Vikings, by the Saxons. I don't think the Normans, actually. The borders of Scotland and England, I should say, but certainly Viking and Saxon. So in my heritage, it's actually them who robbed, in a way, and you can kind of see this in the Scottish, whereas the English have this tradition of the Norman yoke. For the Scots, it is the Norman English who dominate, um, and thus you have Wallace and Bruce and all that. But yeah, I think it's a tricky one. Um, it's a tricky one because you can make that case, but I don't know how watertight it is anymore, just because of when were we robbed, um, as it were. Uh, I don't know. I don't know enough about Saxon society either to really say much more. They logged every acre and building and took an inventory of every property. They stole it all and gave it to their fellow bandits. Well, yes, I can't argue with that. And the Parliament are ancestors of the Normans and are still robbing us today. We want back what belongs to us. Uh, Good leveler popularism here, Flora. I love it. I love it. Uh, Interesting levelers to Locke to the US experiment. Yes, I think you can trace it, especially as Locke wouldn't have. He was raised in a context where he probably was aware of leveler propaganda. So he's likely to have come across it, and obviously Locke influences the American tradition very heavily. So there's a good opportunity. There's a good chance he was influenced directly by the levelers, or if not, then they were such in the culture that he may have come across ideas from others who were influenced by the levelers. Yeah, I think that's how James the First would have seen it, and his opponents too. Good to see you, Ollie. Good to see you. I don't know what the algorithm does these days, but I'm just glad you were able to make it. Let's see. They who have put out the people's eyes reproach them of their blindness. Indeed, and actually, Milton does in other places talk about the Norman Yoke. He refers to the current Stuart regime as Norman. So he may have been thinking in these terms as well. That is true, and when I'm comparing the British and American systems, it's not to say Britain is a better system. It was more just to suggest that there is a really there's a contradiction in how the American Constitution works, with this tension between inalienable rights, but that the system refers to the Constitution to establish precedent. So rights are afforded by the Constitution; they're not inalienable. It's a very strange dynamic. But maybe that's the problem with all legal systems, that they're all to do with precedent. But the issue here is that it's not a system legitimized by precedent, but by the pursuits of life, liberty, and happiness. So it's an interesting kind of. Oh, yeah, you kind of mentioned that here. So that there is this interesting tension there. This, I guess, was in reference to me talking about the 1619 project. Can there be a society without a yoke of some form? Well, strictly speaking, every society has a minority or oligarchy ruling over a majority. Is that a yoke? I guess the issue is whether the minority is deemed legitimate by the ruled, and that depends on the political formula being accepted by the majority, by the ruled. When describing it as a yoke, that sounds like it is an unnecessary and unjustified burden. So, in that case, you could have societies which the populace believe they are being legitimately ruled without. So it's not a yoke, I guess. So that would be one answer to that, and maybe like New England Puritan society where they were all immigrants from England, and they believed in creating a godly community, and that certain men would be elected to oversee this, like John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts. That might be considered as a society where there was a minority ruling and the majority accepted their rule. Although there was a lot of fallings out in New England, so maybe that wasn't a great example. But the majority seemed on board. So it does seem like that it is a possibility. A different question that you might ask, though, is does every society need some sort of story about a golden age and then a fall? Or at least some kind of fall, and we're trying to return or restore certain rights. That might be a more prevalent thing, because certainly the Puritan society saw itself as both reacting against the fall of man and against the fall from Anglo-Saxon times. I need to think more about that, but maybe dividing it in that way might be a helpful uh, way of engaging that question. Thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Snooze, you lose. Vingle, I am glad I've contributed to you scaring some ducks. Of course, the French love ducks, so it's very relevant. There was a terrible band in the 90s called the Levelers. I'm gonna have to look up these up after this. Uh, oh, Leckle, you never liked Sargon. Oh well. Um, well, I mean, I have an ambivalent relationship with him. I think he can say some good things, say some bad things. I just kind of he's very much into the with Lotus Eaters. They've got their it's strong on rank punditry, so it doesn't necessarily give you super deep analysis of things, but I mean it gives you more news than maybe other sources, right? So it's interesting. Morden is a witchy name. Yes, yes. Um, uh, well, we will be spared her premiership, at least. There are others who maybe are worse, who are still in. So, but we will not have her, which is something. Flora. England still is a common law jurisdiction. Most people do not understand that, so are bewildered and blown about by administrative law. See, you are a good Burkean. I love it. I love it. You're appealing to the common law tradition, which has its roots in the Anglo-Saxon Golden Age. Uh, yeah, yeah. I think I think the issue is how do we, if we wanted to go back to that, uh, or restore that, I, without removing the legal system as it stands and the political system, there's no way to restore these things. So there's to return purely to common law. So we're in a bind until there's a dramatic overhaul in Minecraft, of course. I agree. I agree. Nothing more to add there. If you know and understand contract law, then it is pretty easy to live pretty freely with. Well, yeah, yes, it is, but it's if you're brought to court, then it's a tricky thing, isn't it? Because it's they try to overwhelm you and force you into positions that um, it's hard to fight against if you're not used to it. It's tricky. It's tricky. I don't know. I don't know. I feel there would need to be a big overhaul of a lot of things, dramatic change, like the levelers were advocating for, to go back to a proper common law system. But I'll need to look into it more because um, maybe there is a way through the current moment as well. Yes, yes. So you could see it as not a foreign thing now. Um, it's a it's just a question of if you're going to, like Sargon, argue that Christianity is fundamentally not English. At what point are you going to say that thing is English and something else isn't? Because by that sort of logic, Anglo-Saxon isn't English, and yet he thinks Anglo-Saxon is English. So yeah, so I appreciate I'm somewhat using the word English here in a interesting way because technically speaking, the first English are Anglo-Saxons, but there were inhabitants of Britain before the English per se. And I think he doesn't. I think he means just inhabitants of this island. So yeah, so it becomes tricky. But after what was it? There was Christians here in 318 at least AD. So 1700 years, is that long enough to become native? I think so. I think so. Um, indeed, exactly. Um, I have never heard Sargon say this, and I do not believe he thinks this at all. We need to take back what is rightfully ours and use their own slavery, stolen land, colonialism against them. So that sort of argument's going to work a lot better in England than America, right? Because, as you say, it's against the Normans, and it would be using a similar argument as being used by the 1619 Project and all those arguing against whiteness today in America. I don't know how well it would work in America. Um, I think also as well though, people don't recognize these ethnic distinctions anymore. They do on a class level, and you do find this with Marxists, but it again, because it loses that ethnic dimension, you're not going to get we English are reclaiming our stuff from the Normans, because it's devoid of that. It's become uprooted from that sort of argumentation. It's purely on class, and the proletariat are from the world over. So I think it would struggle to make headway here. And that's the key, isn't it? Because if you wanted to make that sort of argument, if it's going to have traction, it needs to be seen as legitimate by others. And indeed, you want people in power to recognize its legitimacy. That's the challenge that we face across a number of different uh, areas, is that our ideas are not deemed as legitimate anymore across lots of things. The people in power tend to have, even if they disagree on parts of policy, the vast majority of people sign up to the political formula of our ruling class. And until that changes, there's no traction to be gained. So we need to discredit the current political formula. And you do that by essentially converting people, not just in their minds, but in their hearts, to have new values, things that they are willing to pursue, even above anything that the current regime offers. So I think in that respect, I can see what I see the strong argument that you're making, that you could make this a similar sort of argument in an English context, but unlike theirs, which is part of the political formula of today, an English kind of argument against Norman property and law won't have that today. Um, it's a kind of funny thing, because rationally it's the same sort of argument, so it should work. So I appreciate what you're saying. Um, it's the feasibility. It's the feasibility. But that's true of a lot of things I talk about. Like a few months ago, I did a stream arguing for a new feudal society. So uh, I don't let feasibility hold you back. That's true, but I think it's particularly well. I don't know other countries, so I don't know as well. But just from my own context, it seems hard to celebrate your own heritage and embrace it and see it as important to who you are anymore. Uh, indeed, indeed, that's the point. It's undermining what it means to be from a particular place. Nowadays, we're defined by what political program you sign up for, and your country is defined by certain politics. So, for example, Scotland under the SNP identifies nationalism, although it's appealing to a very strong understanding of historical memory in its nationalism, has surreptitiously, having got the nationalists on board, identified that with a certain progressive agenda as being integral to Scottishness, even though the broad appeal of Scottish nationalism is independence from England, which isn't necessarily a progressive program. It's a really interesting thing, and I think it's hmm, yeah, it's so there's not this sense of, oh well, my heritage is important to being Scottish. It's just, do I have the right values to be Scottish? Of course, values are a part of our historical memory, but is it actually, if it's divorced from things like um, knowing your own history or celebrating the songs from hundreds of years ago, uh, dress style, going over the old stories, the institutions which have been inherited, do we respect them or are we trying to overturn them? These sorts of things. Uh, we're taught to just treat them as chains rather than as given parts of who we are, which we will give to other people, to our descendants. Lecal. Thinking about the time Belloc gave a lecture just dunking on the Anglos and saying everything good in England came from the Normans, and Tolkien just seethed. Yes, Tolkien would hate that. He would hate it. John, John, you should have seen what the Normans did to the Byzantium. Norman captains being subversive, and then the business with Prince Bohemond. Well, that would be a whole other stream. But yes, the Normans. Maybe there was a Norman Yoke across Christendom. Fingal. So sorry, Norse blood went into making French subversives strong enough to do all of this. Oh well, the Vikings. I mean, they imposed their own yokes, I suppose. But I mean, what the Vikings achieved was pretty remarkable. It must be said. Um, the way that they conquered so many places, ravaged so many places, um, discovered America. Yeah, they. I'd love to read more about the Vikings and their culture. Snoozy Loos. Are there accounts of Normans who were absorbed into Anglo-Saxon culture community, perhaps in rustic areas, even changing their names? I'm afraid I don't know, Snoozy Loos. I wouldn't know where you would even start looking for that. I guess. Hmm. I'm afraid I just don't know where I could point to. You do find Saxons trying to become Norman, or at least in the fiction. Go and read Ivanhoe, and you'll see more. You'll see more. Miot, Yori, good to see you. The lion also doesn't think about eating the gazelle. He just eats. That's true. That's true. And many rulers in the past have not given any thought to who they're ruling. But then maybe uh, that's not necessarily a great basis for securing your rule for a long time, because people will get upset about that, just as we see in today's society, and eventually there's going to be some sort of reaction against it, because also, does that include lower elites in the system? Are they also prey that can be eaten? Um, the weakness of the lion and gazelle metaphor is in part that, whereas that's like two species of predator and prey, power relations are more fluid, aren't they? So where somebody sits on the chain, okay, somebody might be definitely, a pleb might be prey to a predator, but does a lower elite constitute a rival predator, or is it also a form of prey, or is it both? Um, and in that instance, then, if you're treating the nobility as prey, then you're raising a counter elite against you. So it's not quite as I think the issue with that sort of framing, and it's also, incidentally, it was part of the problem with Yarvin's article about hobbits and elves, is that human beings are not distinct species in that way, or classes are not distinct species. And so that causes a problem with the analogy, because the relationships are more complicated and more um, require more nuance as a consequence. At least um, that's that could be an issue with it. Hiya, love. Good to see you. The Normans wasted my northern hometown, but reading of their exploits in Sicily, it's hard not to respect them somewhat. I mean, the harrowing of the north definitely adds to the Norman Yoke, but I'm almost inclined at parts to, that Monty Python sketch from The Life of Brian, where there's that Jewish resistance movement, and they keep saying, "What did the Romans ever do for us? They built the roads, they provided aqueducts, clean water, food, employment. But what did the Romans ever do for us?" You could, with all, they did some pretty terrible things, the Normans, but then they also built so much of what, ironically, something like Sargon would call English or England. Um, so it's a yeah. So there's a it's not, to me, especially as my discipline is history. There's a messiness to people that precludes total categorization as good or bad. Maybe good or bad for a certain group, but each civilization and people group has its own positives and negatives, its own brilliances and its own flaws, and oftentimes they're bound up together. And the Normans were one of these who, in some ways, did unspeakable things, awful things, and on the other hand, achieved, at least for themselves, truly remarkable things. Just think of the great cathedrals, absolutely stunning. The Anglo Saxons didn't achieve that. The Normans did. Does that justify the Norman conquest? I don't think so. Does it say there was something brilliant produced under their reign? Yes, yes. And so, yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. Thank you, Flora, and I really appreciate you tuning in and commenting, and having a bit of back and forth over going back to the common law. It's been good. Um, I see there's a few more comments, so I'll get through them. Uh, you guys are just so thoughtful in your engagements, and I know I said I would try and finish at 9, but I've really been enjoying discussing it. So um, yeah, it's been worthwhile. Thank you, Snooze You Lose. Don't worry, you don't need to keep your comment numbers down. It's always good to be engaging with people who are thoughtful and thinking about these issues. It's not only that, but the concept of a living language combined with the death of the author. Hmm. I need to think about that a bit more. God bless you, John. God bless you. Vingle's just caught up. People saying thanks for the stream is over. It's never over. Indeed, indeed. They've ducked out too early. Flora, I agree that the government bully machine is hard to resist and fight. Yes, sadly, we've seen that in abundance over the last few years. If you have light-colored eyes, you can trace your lineage back to the dawn of man. Okay, I'll take your word for it. I have blue eyes, so I guess I can. The mind wavers, the heart sways. Yes, I guess this is about the Norman cathedrals, maybe? No, this must be earlier. I don't know what you're referring to here, Vingle, but I'll take your word for it that it is impressive. Tolkien held a fiery lecture about the Norman invasion and its consequences when he was still a student at Oxford. I will need to go and look that up, because it sounds great. uh, Whoever leaves for Cigar Stream is a coward and a Norman. Oh, I've just seen. Thank you, Fingal. Yes, it was about the Vikings. It was impressive. It was very impressive, especially as they get often presented as barbaric thugs, basically. And I mean, there's some truth to that. My ancestry probably indicates that, but they managed to colonize a lot of places in a time where great empires were not as feasible. There's something to be said for that. Okay. I didn't mean it in the Elves v Hobbits way. I sorry, I'm not sure what you're referring to here, Miot. I'm sorry. If you're still around, please tell me. Carpenter mentions the Tolkien Norman lecture in the biography. Don't know if it's extant, but it has a funny title. It could be in one of his. There's collections of his essays. Yeah, yeah. I'll have a look. My comment about light colored eyes was referring to the rewriting of history. Oh, okay, okay. Um, yeah, I can see that. I can see that. Well, I think that is the last of the comments. So, just by way of closing, I think the Norman Yoke is a fascinating concept which emerges at a really turbulent time in English history. It's obviously had a significant impact upon the political philosophy or philosophies that have emerged in an English context, and set the ball rolling for a number of different ideas. Uh, it challenges us about the relationship between minority and rule and majorities being ruled. It talks to us about nationalism, about class. It engages us to think about political formulas and how there's different kinds. So one's based on historical events and precedents, and others upon abstract concepts and ideas. It gives us a lens for analysing our own contemporary situations, such as the British class system, really the English class system, or maybe arguments about race relations in America, and maybe also gets us to think about our own current context as well in various ways. It challenges us about the relationship between uh, the legal system and the rights of uh, people depending on their histories, such as the common law tradition we were discussing a bit earlier. And he even questions about national identity. What does it mean to be English? And at what point is something an imposition or something integrated into a national identity? So yes, I think there's a lot to think about here, and what I've tried to do is go over the material and then in the end just raise some discussion points really without necessarily committing to any definite conclusions about the topics. I hope that you have all enjoyed it or at least learnt something. And yes, I hope that you have a good evening. I believe there is a cigar stream on just now, so it should have started. It usually starts late, but it should have started by now. So head over there to hear what they're talking about. I'm probably not going to be around for to do more videos for a while because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm currently writing a book which is due next year, but I've got a lot of writing to do. I'm currently on chapter 4, and I'm starting writing it tomorrow. And then I'll be writing my talk for the Witten or the Witten, being hosted by Shieldings this year. Um, Folks that are going will be people like Yavin, AA, Sargon, and I'm thankfully going to be talking with some of these and giving a talk. So yes, so I might not be around as much, but I hope to produce at least one video next month. And till then, may God bless you all. May you all have a good evening. And yes, I hope to see you soon. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Good night.